Wally-hoo!
If you were able to travel back in time 2,000 years and meet one of your ancient ancestors, you'd be able to blow their mind with technology. Imagine what someone living so long ago would think of your mobile phone or your smartwatch. Don't let that thought make you feel superior, though, because they might be able to show you a mind-blowing thing or two in return. There's a great deal that we don't understand about the technology of our ancestors, as you're about to find out. The Iron Pillar of Delhi was created more than 1,500 years ago. You'd never guess that by looking at it, though, because there isn't a trace of rust on it. That isn't because it's regularly cleaned and polished. It's because it's physically impossible for the pillar to rust. The Iron Column, which is sometimes called the Ashoki Pillar, stands 22 feet tall. Every inch of those 22 feet is coated in a rust-proof substance called misawite, which prevents the surface of the iron from being exposed to oxygen. Without that contact, rust can't occur. It's so difficult to imagine that the people who made the pillar all that time ago knew how to prevent rusting that most scientists think it was probably an accident. Their best guess is that the misawite formed under freakish, one-off conditions as the hot iron mixed with lime, slag, and damp air while it cooled. Once it became apparent that their pillar was never going to rust, the ancient residents of Delhi looked upon it as a miracle. The idea that this was a happy accident is backed up by the fact that no other rust-proof Indian objects from this era have ever been found. We're staying in India for a moment because we have a very strange carving inside a temple to look at. This is Panchavarnaswamy Temple in Warayur, Tamil Nadu, and it's more than 2,000 years old. That means the carvings on its wall are also, presumably, more than 2,000 years old. And so we have a problem. Here, plain as day, we see a carving of a man riding a bicycle. That shouldn't be possible, because the bicycle wasn't invented until the 18th century. Still, though, there doesn't seem to be anything else that this carving could represent. Whatever this person is sitting on has 2 wheels, spokes, a frame, and handlebars. The presence of the bicycle carving inside the temple remains an unexplained mystery. The only plausible explanation seems to be that the temple was renovated during the 1920s. This is around the same time that chain-driven bicycles entered mass production and became popular, so it's possible that an artist of the time thought it was a fine idea to deface an ancient temple by adding bicycle graffiti. That theory isn't proven, though, and anyone caught performing such an act of vandalism would likely have faced dire consequences. During the peak years of the Roman Empire, the Romans mastered the art of making glass and concrete. In fact, the concrete they made is vastly superior to the concrete we use today. Portland cement, which is about the industry standard today, would only last for about a century in a marine environment, even if it were to be reinforced with rebar. Compare that to the ancient Roman arches, breakwaters, aqueducts, and other buildings which have remained standing for 2,000 years. Even in highly corrosive salt water, Roman concrete remains intact. That's all down to the way they made it. The Romans combined volcanic ash and lime to create mortar, then mixed it with volcanic rock as aggregate. You can find evidence of this in the construction of the Pantheon, and also Trajan's markets in Rome. Using this mixture means that the Roman concrete that still exists today is full of tobermorite, zeolite, and philipsite. These minerals got there as seawater found its way into the concrete and reacted with the lime and volcanic ash, creating the interlocking minerals and filling void spaces. Exposure to seawater made the concrete stronger, not weaker. As for the reasons we don't use it today, nobody's ever been able to get the mixture quite right since the fall of the Roman Empire. The Inca created hundreds of incredible stone monuments in Peru, and nobody really knows how. In many places, the stones appear to have been sliced through like butter to achieve their current shapes, but that ought to be impossible. What if it wasn't, though? What if our ancient ancestors knew of a way to soften stone by mixing different plants together and applying the mixture to the surface of hard rock? That sounds ridiculous, but it's a suggestion that comes from the Incas' records. Some historians have speculated that the art of softening stone happened not only in Peru but all over the world. Look at the famous handprints of White Mountain in Wyoming, USA. How were they created? Clearly, somebody carved them into the rock, but the carvings are smooth and look like they were left in wet cement. The existence of such a plant mixture would certainly explain how our ancestors were able to move, cut, and shape enormous stones that weigh hundreds of tons. The big question, of course, is what these plants could have been, and where to find them. If they ever existed at all, perhaps they were overused to such an extent that one or more of the species of plant involved in the mixture is now extinct. If you needed a high-quality sword during the Middle Ages, you'd insist that your sword maker fashioned your weapon out of Wootz steel, also known as Damascus steel. It was known as the hardest steel in the world at the time, but its origins go back much earlier than the Middle Ages. It's another Indian invention, and it began there more than 1,000 years before anyone else discovered the recipe and the process for making it. Damascus steel is a type of crucible steel, by which we mean it's made by melting all the ingredients together in a crucible mold and then pouring it into a cast. It's possible that the word Wootz is a corruption of the South Indian word uku, which means steel. The first record of the word in the English language comes from the late 18th century. By then, the Indians had been making it for about 2,000 years. The quality of Indian steel is even referred to in the records of Alexander the Great. It's thought that the secret of how to make Damascus steel was protected, passed down from father to son rather than being written anywhere. That allowed India to monopolize the production and export of the metal for hundreds of years. In April 2021, northern Peru struggled with the consequences of a prolonged drought. In an attempt to solve the problem, farmers turned to a gift left to them by their ancient ancestors. Unable to obtain sufficient water via conventional means, the farming community began restoring the network of pre-Columbian stone canals in the region, all of which are more than 1,000 years old. The locals refer to the canals as amulas and believe they were created by the native inhabitants of the Huarochirí province around 1,400 years ago. That dates them to a time not only before the arrival of Europeans, but also before the emergence of the Inca. The cleverly designed canals follow the slopes of the mountains and direct runoff rainwater to areas of permeable rock and soil, where it slowly filters through and fills aquifers before descending into springs weeks or even months later. This is how the indigenous people ensured they had a supply of water long after the rainy season ended. It's thought that restoring the full canal network will take until 2025 at the least, but they've already restored 17 out of the 67 kilometers of canals and created enough water to sustain over 80,000 people for 12 months. This is an ancient solution to a modern problem. Peru contains many fantastic examples of ancient technology, so let's stay there a little longer and talk about puquillos. It's thought that this hydraulic system was created by the Nazca culture, who were also responsible for the world-famous Nazca lines. From above, this site looks like a spiral carving and could be interpreted as a work of art, but it serves a far more practical purpose than that. The spirals are surface channels, leading to reservoirs and aqueducts beneath the ground. Thanks to the existence of puquios, the people who lived here in ancient times had a supply of water they could rely on throughout the dry season. That was especially important in this part of the world because the dry season could sometimes last more than a full calendar year. Such is the sophistication of this water system that archaeologists initially assumed that it must have been created by the Spanish after their arrival in the region, rather than by the people who were here before them, who were assumed to be too primitive to have come up with them. That assumption was both arrogant and racist. The Spanish used this system, but they didn't create it. The ancient Romans were very fond of wine and came up with some innovative designs for wine presses, but they were just as innovative when it came to designing olive oil presses. Olive oil was extremely important to the Romans because they believed it had healing qualities. The personal physician of Emperor Julian once wrote that he used olive oil as a base to make ointments for the emperor, as well as coating plasters in it before applying them to wounds. Roman soldiers, who are known to have been extremely superstitious, often drank olive oil before important battles. The most advanced olive oil press they ever came up with as a civilization was the trapetum, and the best preserved trapetum ever discovered by archaeologists comes from the ruins of the city of Pompeii. The press works by pouring olives into the bowl and then crushing them between the two large concave stones attached to the beam. The beam is connected to an iron pivot, and the whole thing was usually secured to a post, which allowed stones to turn inside it. Archaeologists believe they were usually lined up in groups of 3 and produced near industrial quantities of the prized liquid on a daily basis. We know that the odometer is an ancient invention, but we don't know which ancient inventor to credit it with. Heron of Alexandria includes a design for an odometer in his manuscript Dioptra, and claims the invention as his own. But Vitruvius also produced an odometer design about 2,000 years ago, and might have based his work on a design created even longer ago than that by Archimedes. The first working model, though, was almost certainly based on the Vitruvian design. It's both incredibly simple and incredibly clever. The Vitruvian odometer is, in essence, a wheelbarrow with one large, hollow wheel full of pebbles. Each time the wheel turned, it dropped a pebble into the wheelbarrow. If you knew the circumference of the wheel, you could work out how far you'd traveled by multiplying the circumference by the number of pebbles in your wheelbarrow. This basic method made it possible to calculate the exact distance between 2 points for the first time. This was hugely useful to the Roman military, but it was just as useful for map makers. The accuracy of maps improved enormously after the introduction of the odometer. By this stage in the video, we should all be very clear that our ancient ancestors were capable of more than we generally give them credit for. Surely, though, they couldn't have come up with a way of refrigerating food. Actually, they did. You might think that it's impossible to create a refrigerator without electricity, but you'd be wrong. The Persians had refrigerator units 2,400 years ago, and they called them yakhchals. There's a clue to their purpose in the name, which translates into English as ice pits, but it's a bad translation. Yakhchals aren't pits. They're more like giant tents. The Persians built their yakhchals 60 feet high and channeled water into them from nearby springs. The water was then cooled by using wind catchers, and a cooling system based on evaporation removed heat and moisture. To finish things off, the exterior of each yakhchal was coated with thick layers of sand, clay, egg whites, and goat hair to reflect the heat of the sun and ensure the contents remained chilled. We imagine those outer surfaces gave off an incredible stink, but so long as they kept the food inside them fresh, they were doing their job. We've looked at a few hydraulic systems in this video, but not one that's older than this next stunning example of ancient technology. It was discovered in the lower Yangtze River area of China in December 2017, and archaeologists believe it to be one of the oldest water management projects in the world. Flooding was a constant risk to the people who lived here 5,000 years ago, and so they did something about it. Over the course of about 50 years, they dug out canals, piled the land to create dams, and introduced a gating system so they could control the flow of water. The system they created is spread across 10,000 hectares of land. 10 million cubic feet of earth were moved in the process. Experts estimate that creating just one of the larger dams would have taken a team of 3,000 people 8 years to accomplish. As huge as this water management system was, it ultimately failed. The ancient city of Liangshu was claimed by an enormous flood around 4,200 years ago, leaving the entire area buried beneath 2 feet of clay and forcing its abandonment. There were many ways of marking the passage of time between the invention of the sundial and the invention of the clock. For the ancient Egyptians, one of those methods was the merket. It looks like a simple device, but it isn't. A merket is made from a bar of wood or bone, covered in notches and carvings. The bars are attached to weighted plumb lines. There are 24 notches along the length of the bars. That isn't one for each hour of the day, though. There's a specific notch for sunrise, another for sunset, 8 to track the movements of celestial bodies through the night sky, and the other for tracking the sun throughout the day. A merket is more useful than a sundial because a sundial struggles to track time after the sun goes down, even if the moon is bright. Some archaeologists think that merkets may also have been used to measure angles, which would have been useful when designing and constructing temples. The oldest merket we're aware of is on display to the public at the Science Museum of London in England and is about 2,600 years old. However, that's not to say that the first merket wasn't made long before then. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!